Greetings, greenhouse people. It's time for another episode of Tech on Demand brought to you by Growertalks magazine. If you don't receive Growertalks and Green Profit every month, head over to growertalks.com and subscribe. We've been bringing news and information to the industry for more than 75 years, so if you're not a subscriber, it's about time. And speaking of subscribing, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite app. Once you subscribe, you'll never miss an episode. I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and this time we're here to share critical information for both nursery and greenhouse producers. You may not know exactly how much time, labor, and ultimately money you spend each year managing weeds in outdoor and indoor production, but I can guarantee you it's a lot. If you don't have protocols and strategies for weed control, that can lead to even bigger issues. That's why I've invited two guests from Envu onto the podcast to talk through best management practices related to weed control, and specifically the use of Marengo, a game-changing kind of pre-emergence herbicide that not only controls more than 90 weeds, including broadleaf weeds, grasses, and sedge, but also clocks in with residual activity for up to 8 months. It's labeled for use inside greenhouses and can be a key player in your greenhouse sanitation lineup. My guests are Dr. Janna Beckerman and Steve Larson from Envu. Both have decades of experience in our industry and bring a lot to the table when it comes to the science behind greenhouse and nursery production, as well as the real-world application of products and strategies. When it comes to weed control in production settings, I think Janna said it best. The greatest cost is the cost of neglect. Listen all the way to the end of this episode for words of wisdom like that and much, much more. Before we start, here's a little bit about my guests. Dr. Janna Beckerman is the new ornamentals technical specialist at Envu and part of their green services team. Prior to Envu, she worked at Purdue University and the University of Minnesota as a professor of plant pathology for almost 25 years. Janna continues to focus on developing environmentally sound pest management strategies that are economically feasible for growers and pest managers of specialty crops, and is now excited to also focus on insect and weed management. During his more than 45 years in turf and ornamentals, Steve Larson has worked as a grower and in various roles in technical sales, marketing, and technical support. He's worked in container nursery production, greenhouse crop production, and a variety of technical roles for Heinz Nurseries, the Scotts Company, BASF, and Envu. Currently, Steve is the greenhouse and nursery sales specialist for Envu covering the central U.S. He's based in Katy, Texas, a suburb of Houston, and earned his bachelor's and Master of Science degrees in horticulture from Purdue University. Sounds like it's a Purdue reunion today, but that's enough out of me. Let's get into it. Janna, Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Good to be here.
Awesome. And before we get started with the specific topic, Marengo and weed control, I'm really kind of interested in Envu because I think a lot of the listeners have probably heard the name, but might not actually be too aware of the company's history. And I know that your portfolio has expanded recently, even adding new products in 2025. Can you call out a few of these new products, the current products in your assortment for greenhouse producers and nursery growers? Steve, why don't you go ahead and kick this one off? But Janna, definitely jump in and share some of your favorite products for different situations.
Well, thanks, Bill. Thanks again for having us on the podcast. And I just wanted to make sure everyone understands that it's not Envu, it's Envu. It's like we're in view. And Envu is actually a recently newly formed business that was the former specialty division, like most of us refer to it as, from Bayer. And that includes not just the turf and ornamentals business, but also included our veg management business, our structural pest control, and some other businesses, mosquitoes as well. And it was a global business venture in that Bayer decided to divest themselves of their specialty group. We were purchased by a venture capital company, and now we are a standalone international company. It was a pretty substantial business transaction, over $2 billion. And as a result of that, first of all, we brought all of the historically formed Bayer products along with us, so that pipeline and that relationship remains. We're still strong partners with Bayer as far as newly discovered molecules would be concerned going down the road. But also it's given us a little room to operate in terms of acquisitions and licensing deals, and two of which have taken place with us most recently and were effective the first of the year. One was FMC sold their specialty group off to us at Envu, their former GSS business. And so products, as you asked about, that would include things like Talstar, Aria, Dorentus, Onyx Pro. I'm sure I'm going to forget a few, which Jan will fill in the gaps for me. And then parallel to that, we also licensed in some new products from a company called UPL. They're principally a generics company, but they hold first rights of refusal on a number of chemistries, and those have come over to us as well at the same time. So Terrazole, Adept, B9, Floramite, Shuttle, also were a part of that licensing agreement. So our portfolio, in terms of numbers, just literally doubled in size, and our business grew quite substantially as a result. So sorry, kind of a long-winded answer to your short question, but that's where we stand today. And all of those products are now under the Envu umbrella.
Which is, I think, important for growers to know, because a lot of those are just well-respected, widely known products in the industry, and now available from Envu. Janna, do you have any...
We'll do our best not to screw it up. That's what we say.
You guys won't. Janna, do you have anything to add to that part of the discussion?
No, I think Steve pretty much summarized, where we've been. I guess the only thing I would add is that we have a couple new products, some new AIs on the horizon that we will be announcing probably in the third to fourth quarter of this year, and will hopefully be available early in 2026. So
awesome, and that'll be good. We'll have to circle back next year and talk about them, because new AIs from a company is scientific and well respected as you guys probably means some pretty awesome solutions for growers.
We're pretty excited about what we have coming down the pipeline.
Oh, that's great. I think, I just wanted to frame the discussion with a little bit about Envu for some of the listeners who might not have been aware. Just really showcase kind of the heritage and respected position that you guys have. But why don't we move right into our topic for the day, which is weed control. We're going to, I think, come at it from a few different angles, but I want to focus on Marengo because, when we talked leading up to this, it has been around for a little while. Maybe you can nail down the exact introduction year, but it really has proven to be quite a game changer for a lot of nursery and greenhouse producers. And when we talked before recording, you were talking about how growers really truly love this product, and so I'm wondering, Janna, why don't you talk a little bit about Marengo and some of the benefits it does offer to growers that they like so much.
So some of the benefits, probably the biggest benefit that it offers growers is the extended duration of control that it provides, depending on how it is applied. And we promote the use of a split application. You can get up to 8 months of control, which far exceeds any of the competitor products on the market. And it's doing this with a single mode of action chemistry. A lot of products are premixes, and which there's nothing wrong with that, but this is, a single molecule capable of providing this kind of extensive control, is just, there's nothing else like it out there. It's also got, because it isn't a new molecule, there have been numerous tests to evaluate how effective and safe it is when used as a pre-emergent in nursery crops in particular. And I believe we have, is it over 270 plants that have been, it's probably more like over 300 at this point, that have been successfully trialed. And one of the interesting things about the label that I thought was really proactive is the label is written so that growers can also do their own trials on farm to see if they are able to use it in this over-the-top application as well. So to my mind, those things stood out for me on a scientific basis. One of my early experiences was being out at plant peddlers and having a grower come up and ask about weed control. And before I could even say anything, having this other grower come in there and say, "Oh my gosh, you just want to get this product. It's so great." And just bite down when you look at the price, but you won't regret it. And it was really funny. I never really got to say anything about how great the product was. The guy grabbed all the literature, said he was going to buy it, and walked away. And it was just like, this literally is a product that sells itself. And I would say, since I've been at Envu now for a year, everybody really, really loves the product. That's, which is gratifying.
For sure. And in our industry, which is, I guess, relatively small, but very close knit, getting that kind of peer-to-peer,
Exactly.
I guess, approval on a product is really a big deal and says a lot.
Yeah. And the experience, I mean, that's, the anecdata, as I call it, is important, but I know that there was an internal survey done where people discussed, their likelihood to be repeat consumers, repeat buyers, and things like that. And one of our studies, it had 67% of growers said that they were, likely to use Marengo again. And I mean, those are just, the data is fantastic. So it isn't just anecdata, but actual data also supports that growers are really pleased with using this product.
No, that's great. That's great. Steve, any good stories? I'm sure you've worked with a lot of growers using Marengo.
Well, in Janna's story at Plant Peddlers is not unusual. I think our biggest fans and our biggest source of success in the marketplace has a lot to do with successful grower use of the product and just them kind of spreading the word for us. I jokingly tell growers, when you buy it, you'll hate me. 6 months later, you'll hug me, because it's that kind of product. I've been doing this for over 45 years in the industry. Yeah. I've launched a lot of products through the course of my career. This is one of the products that I can stand behind more confidently than any product I've ever had the opportunity, the good fortune really to sell. It's kind of one of those things, sort of a once in a career type product. And to add on to Janna's comment about that it's a single molecule, it's very unusual to find a single molecule with such a breadth of weed control in terms of the spectrum of weed control. Broadleafs, grasses, and actually suppresses germination of sedge seeds, not the nutlets, not the vegetative, but the seed propagation. And it's very unusual to find a molecule that does that and still allows the level of plant safety that we've come to appreciate with the product.
Well, and that's a good segue, because I am interested in the active ingredient. What can you tell us about it, Stephen? Maybe, I know that there is a liquid and granular formulation of Marengo. Maybe talk a little bit about the different uses for those and what exactly this product is that's going to battle against.
Yeah,
like you said, broadleaf weeds, grasses, sedge. I mean, that it covers a lot.
Yeah, a great question. I'm not sure I can get it all, but that's why you have two of us on the podcast, because Janna does a good job remembering the many things that I forget. Indaziflam, by the way, is the active ingredient. It's just a word we love to say. It rolls off the tongue nicely, indaziflam. And but it is as I mentioned, it's a molecule that's been formulated into two different formulations. So we do have a liquid formulation, which is a more concentrated formulation. And I like growers to remember that the liquid formulation doesn't perform better than the granular. However, when you put the liquid out at the highest use rates, you are actually applying more of the active ingredient per unit area treated than you are with a granular. The granular was formulated with over-the-top applications to plant materials, both in the landscape as well as container-grown nursery stock. And so consequently, they tend to, this is just the way regulatory people think, they tend to back off of the concentration and the rates there just because they're oftentimes wanting to make sure growers have a good experience and don't want to have any resulting plant injury. However, I can say that we have a lot of growers that use the liquid formulation as directed sprays, both in field-grown nursery stock as well as in some larger containers. And I'm in the South where I am, and I've covered many parts of the South all the way out to California. And I would say most tree growers that are growing in larger containers will say 20 gallons and up or 15 gallons and up, especially those that are growing trees with a single trunk. Almost all of them use the liquid formulation because they can direct the spray to the base of the plant so easily. However, that said, the granular formulation is a formulation that works well on a wide range of container-grown nursery stock. So that includes ground covers, it includes shrubbery, maybe smaller trees, from 1 gallons all the way up. And so there are specific uses for those. One other use that we find to be kind of surprised me a little bit is the liquid formulation is used a lot for weed control in and around growing areas. So not necessarily directly over the top of plants, but certainly all around the plants. For example, on gravel of nursery beds, maybe and this is one close to your heart, Bill, it's inside of greenhouses. Yeah. We can actually go in with a product, and Marengo is one of the few labeled products for use, both the liquid and the granular. We can treat the production beds, the ground area, maybe under benches or graveled areas on hoop houses or greenhouses. But we can actually keep the source of weeds, which I think is one of the greatest problems in weed control, is controlling the source. Weeds that are growing up from the ground all around the plants, and their weed seed find a way into the containers or into the plant material. So,
and this is, I'm going to jump in here because this is super important for IPM, because those plants that are, either volunteers in pots or adjacent to the nursery and greenhouse or growing within the nursery or greenhouse serve as a really important reservoir, not just for thrips, but for all sorts of different mites as well. So when we talk about IPM, a lot of times, particularly in the greenhouse, we forget weed IPM. And, the areas around the pipes and things like that, you always end up finding weeds sprouting up, or at least maybe because I'm always looking for it now, I'm always finding weeds sprouting up there. But, here's a great use to apply a pre-emergent like Marengo and prevent this from happening, and prevent your thrips and your white flies and your spider mites, but all of your mites for that, getting on your oxalis, your bittercress, all of the things that will take advantage of those gaps in your control.
Definitely. And Steve, you said it was close to my heart. Well, that's because we constantly are preaching sanitation through all of our tech on demand resources, because when you start clean, you have such a better chance of producing that clean crop. And you're right, the weeds in and around greenhouses and outdoor production are sometimes overlooked. But you're right, Janna, when those of us who talk about this walk into a greenhouse or nursery, it's almost some of the first things that you spot. It's like when you go into your own house, you notice that dirty corner that a lot of people might not notice. So,
and it's not just the weed itself, but it has the virus load that it has. Then you talk about fungus gnats and shore flies coming into vector pythium and rhizoctonia, and going back to your sanitation comment. It's just so hard to get on top of these once they get established. And I was thinking about that, and I looked up some numbers before because I'm a nerd and this is what I do. And so I found out that a single goosegrass plant can produce over 120,000 seed per season, wow. A single goosegrass. And then Palmer amaranth can more than double that to 250,000 seeds per plant.
Wow.
So, which makes oxalis which makes it look like a slacker because it only can produce about 5,000 seeds per plant. But we all know how they explode. And it turns out those actually have almost 100% germination. So trying to stay on top with that sanitation is just so challenging. And if you fall behind, it's so hard to get caught up again. So it's as great as Marengo is, you still need an integrated approach for all of your weed management to stay on top of it, because these guys are relentless.
Well, and once you fall behind, it's also really expensive to get caught up again because of the cost of the labor that you need to remove those weeds by hand. So
exactly.
Well, as our Fram commercial folks used to say, you can pay me now or you can pay me later.
Right.
And I've repeated that statement many times because it's a real truth in greenhouses and in nurseries. That upfront effort just pays dividends in a really tangible way.
Definitely. And when I was reading through the product literature on Marengo, it indicates that it's best applied in the fall to control weeds in the spring. And as I read it, I don't know, maybe it didn't make as much sense to me as it did when we talked through it preparing for this podcast. But I'm interested in your explanation, because there is more to this story. And Janna, you mentioned split applications. I do want to touch on that. the multiple applications to target other seasons in spring. But I don't know if I'm phrasing this question right, but I think you guys know what I mean. So if either one of you want to kind of clarify or explain why this fall application is a good route to take, but also, other times within the year and within different seasons.
If you don't mind, I'll start on that one just because it's not a simple answer, because we have a big country with lots of different regions, different growing seasonality and regionality for each area in terms of the weed species. I think some of that thinking initially came more from the application of the liquid formulation on field-grown nursery stock because of the nature of that business when they're digging plants and trying to transplant, taking advantage of the dormant season. And they oftentimes try to get their pre-emergence herbicides down at a period of time when maybe they're not quite as busy. And Marengo is a well-suited product for that purpose. You can go out in the late fall, say around Thanksgiving, make a treatment with Marengo Flow, and it'll just sit there on the ground. It has a very long half-life. It doesn't degrade readily over the course of the winter. Cooler temperatures reduce the amount of microbial degradation, which is the number one reason most pre-emergent herbicides get degraded over time, is from microbes. Not the only reason, by the way, but an important one. And so when springtime comes around, your pre-emergent herbicide's sitting there ready to go. Hence, maybe the thought of using fall applications. In my geography, growers tend to think more of late winter because we have days here in the South. Certainly, I watch this every year. Every single year that I've been alive, and I've been alive a long time, we have at least one 70-degree day or more, probably multiple in January, and at least one or more 80-degree days in February here in South Texas. And so we have days when we can get out and do real work. And so I tend to tell growers to make their Marengo treatments for spring controlled weeds during that late dormant season. And I use holidays to just as a reminder for growers, but I tell them, get it out before Valentine's Day. If you get your pre-emergence herbicide, and when I'm talking about the South, I'm talking sort of south of the Mason-Dixon line. So, this is Tennessee, Oklahoma, and south into Florida, Southern California. And so we can get a treatment out at that period of time. We'll have pretty good weed control going through the very busy spring months when the growers would rather deploy their work staff into other areas, principally loading trucks, hopefully, and also spacing plants and other things that go on during the spring. Now, that's a simplistic answer, but I think that time frame addresses all of your questions with regards to a fall. I'm just saying a late winter, with the whole idea that the dormant season, we can use it to our advantage with Marengo because we'll get weed control in the spring, even if we make those treatments in advance. So I hope that made sense.
It did. Yeah, for sure.
I would just also tag in that a lot of the weeds that you see in the spring, whether it's your henbit, your chickweed, your bitter cress, or your annual bluegrass, all of those are going to be your fall and winter emerging weeds. It's not until later in the summer where you get, your summer weeds of like your goosegrass and your spurge. And so early on, when you're seeing those things, the control meant it should have been months earlier, probably in the fall. Or even, sometimes late summer. And I guess that's one of the things also to stress, that we might not be in agreement with everything going on in the world, but I think all of the growers, if you put them together, would say that the weather's getting weird. And, things that people assumed that us living in the Midwest, Bill, we always expect to have like these spring, wet springs. Yeah. And then it dries out along July and August. But the last couple of years, we've actually have droughty springs. And
true.
And then we also have had the last couple of years monsoons in August. So really looking at what your weather conditions are like is really important to make sure whatever herbicide you're using, you're deploying it correctly. And for the best impact of it. And Marengo is no different in that respect.
Makes a lot of sense, really. It does come down to paying attention to what's going on weather-wise and reacting accordingly. Why don't we, And we've talked about we've talked quite a bit about this, but why don't we try to get into a little bit more detail about weed control, maybe specifically in nurseries, because it can be expensive to battle weeds for all sorts of different reasons. But when you talk about the regionality and seasonality, when it comes to applying a product like Marengo, you guys have at Envu have really cool resources. We were looking through one of the documents that does break it down by location and season and a lot of the timing. And I'll put links to those in the show notes for sure. But can you talk the listeners through your approach when it comes to working with nursery growers about when to apply Marengo, or even if you're using other products at the same time, how that works? Like when you walk into a nursery, they're having a challenge with weeds. How do you talk them through that process? And whoever wants to start, go for it.
Steve was involved with the development of the document, so I would defer to him on this one.
Cool.
We're not so proud at Envu to think that Marengo is the only product that works. In fact, there are some great pre-emergence herbicides out there. I was fortunate enough to be working at BASF when we launched Freehand, for example, and so I was intimately involved with that. And up until I went to work with Marengo, Freehand was the best pre-emergence herbicide out there, at least in my mind. This is a salesman talking here a little bit. But the point is this, Bill, is that there is no best pre-emergence herbicide for a year-round use. We would never recommend back-to-back uses of any product, including ours. And I do believe there are pre-emergence herbicides that work best during different times of the year, because your weed pressure comes from different types of weeds at different times of the year, as Janna just was talking about. So we have some spring type weeds that we might want to deal with. We have some summer type weeds. We might have some fall type weeds. And so we developed a resource, a nursery management brochure, nursery management guide that Bill had mentioned, and hopefully you guys will be able to access that and look at it. We looked at 7 regions around the United States, identified the key weeds that growers experience in those regions, and it was places like South Florida, the Gulf Coast, the Central U.S., the Pacific Northwest, et cetera. And what we did is we tried to formulate a rotation of pre-emergence herbicides that placed the best performing herbicide at the best time of the year. So we like to see Marengo in the spring in a lot of these examples across the U.S. We like Freehand in the summer because it's really effective on different spurge species. It's really effective. We like flumioxazin, which is the active ingredient in Broadstar and Sureguard, in the fall because it has a strong control on some key broadleaf fall and winter weeds like bittercress, for example. So when you start getting the right herbicides placed at the right time of the year in the right sequence, that's when you start to build a program that has real durability and strength. Plus, the recommendations have different herbicides with different modes of action, so that we're not just we're doing things in a responsible way from a stewardship of the chemistries that are out there. Most people don't realize that we only have about 4 or 5, maybe 6, but I think it's about 4 or 5 modes of action of pre-emergence herbicides. It's a very small number. And so consequently, it's very easy to start using the same mode of action over and over and over again, not really realize it because you're switching brand names, but not modes of action.
Right.
So,
and to tag on to what Steve said, it's so important to have that rotation in there with those different modes of action, but also, tweaking it to make sure, maybe you have more grassy weeds versus broadleaf weeds. And, so you might want to use tower and barricade versus tower and help me out here, Steve, I'm blanking. Dimension.
A gallery
Dimension.
Or something like that.
Which still gives you that, is that 15 plus 3? It changes your mode of action, but gives you the right control. And all of that went into developing that guide. But again, using it in rotation together over the course of the whole season allows you to deplete your weed seed bank, which goes back to pet subject of sanitation. We're just reducing the amount there, which is so important, not just for managing the weeds, but also managing herbicide resistance, because as Steve pointed out, we don't have a lot of modes of action here to work with.
True. No matter what chemistries you're talking about, we always kind of are proponents of rotation to reduce resistance on whatever pest or weed you're going after. And that is definitely the most responsible way to use these products, and with the best success.
Exactly.
Which is really the end goal. So that's outdoor production, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But I am also interested in indoor production. You talked about the use of Marengo as one of the only, or maybe the only, product labeled for pre-emergence weed control within a greenhouse or on floors. Can you talk about the benefits that greenhouse growers can expect from Marengo? I know your research indicates it's safe to use on 270 or more crops, which is a huge number. Janna, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the successes growers have had using this product inside a greenhouse?
So inside a greenhouse, we want to make really clear that this is not to be applied over the top for any of our greenhouse plants, our bedding plants, perennials, and things like that. However, use in the greenhouse can be under the bench, obviously, to reduce any weed development, those drainage pipe areas, things like that. We do recommend that you not have fans going to make sure there is no volatilization. However, we know that volatilization with this product is low to inconsequential. That really is how safe it is for use in a greenhouse, which I believe it is unique in that it is one of the few products that it is the only product that can be used in a greenhouse when plants are in the actual greenhouse. So again, really important. I just think of the number of greenhouses. I used to be a professor at a university, and I swear we might have had more plants under the benches than we had on the benches, and these were not good plants to have under the benches. I'm looking at you, Oxalis, and all of the thrips and things that go with it. So, I really think that it's so easy for a grower to get overwhelmed with things, and then try and dig themselves out. So then trying to really start the season off well before you're going into that greenhouse by putting down some sort of, putting down a pre-emergent like Marengo, or putting down a pre-emergent of another company's product, but then, a few weeks or months in, when it's time to rotate, adding Marengo into that rotation to keep that protection going for the rest of the growing cycle.
Steve, anything within greenhouses that you tend to look to Marengo for?
Well, I think it is unique in that Marengo is labeled for use there, and Janna touched on it. It has inconsequential volatilization, which is really crucial, obviously, since you're in an enclosed space. I would add to what she said about turning the fans off to limit drift. So you want to make sure that you don't, when you're spraying the product, that it doesn't drift onto other plants. But the Marengo label does allow you to make treatments in maybe a big gutter connected house. You can go in certain bays and make treatments in those areas, even though there's some plants in other parts of the gutter connected house area. And so it's okay to do that. Oftentimes growers will also include a non-selective post-emergence herbicide with that treatment. Most of you know those products to be one of two, which is glufosinate, which is the active in phenolic, or glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup. I really like glufosinate, and so I want to hear the people from BASF cheering over there. It's their product, but it's a nice, effective product for use in a greenhouse for that purpose. And we used to own that product, and so they were jointly tested together back in the early stages of testing. So I know that the two of those in combination work real well. So if you've got some little emerged weeds while you're trying to put your pre-emergence out, oftentimes the pre-emergence herbicide will not reach back and kill those. We call it a reach back effect. And Marengo has no reach back in its abilities. But when it's combined with an inexpensive post-emergence herbicide, I think it's a smart thing to do. You're out there making the effort anyway. And let me the Marengo is already in the tank. Why not put something in there that's not that expensive that can take out those a lot of times emerged weeds that you might not even be able to see.
Sure.
They might be relatively small. So yeah, that'd be my the thing to add there, and just as always, follow label directions on all of this kind of stuff. But
Right.
we're happy to help growers if they have some more specific questions there.
So you're tank mixing those then?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly
That's cool.
correct. Yeah, Marengo goes in the tank first, and then Roundup or Finale goes in second.
Okay.
And off you go.
Oh, that's awesome. And when I was poking around the Envu website about Marengo, trying to do my homework before we talked, I saw a video, and again, I'll put that link in the show notes, but it explained best practices for applying Marengo liquid and granular products. How hard is, or how challenging is application? Is there a learning curve on that? And maybe some tips that you tell growers, or that you've picked up over your experience with this product. And I'm interested when to treat and ways to reduce that risk of drift. We talked about keeping the fans off and that kind of thing, but in application, Steve, why don't,
Sure.
If you have experience helping growers with the application process,
I've actually worked
let's hear some of your tips.
On the two best videos ever produced in our industry. Years ago, I was involved in the freehand calibration video, and then more recently with the Marengo, because I think this is one area where growers really struggle.
Yeah.
Because you tend to think when you're going to make an application, you think in terms of what you've been doing with a miticide or an insecticide or a fungicide, where you're mixing up a concentration of the chemistry in a tank, X number of fluid ounces or X number of ounces in 100 gallons or 25 gallons, whatever the case.
Right.
And then you just go spray to saturation to the point to where you have runoff of the plant as you're treating it. So you're treating those plants. In this case, with a herbicide, we're actually trying to create a barrier, a uniform barrier. And so we're putting a prescribed amount of product per unit area of the active ingredient. So really the concentration that we mix up in the tank is less important. It's how much of the active ingredient we're applying per unit area, whether it's a square foot, 1,000 square feet per acre. Most of the rates come to us in terms of rate per 1,000 or rate per acre.
Yep.
And you could even do metric if you want to go crazy.
You could do grams per hectare, and I'll defer you to Dr.
Just putting it out there
Beckerman
for our Canadian counterparts.
And I find that this is one area where growers struggle a little bit on how to calibrate for those treatments. Very important that you use a flat fan nozzle, not a cone. Important that you keep your pressure of your sprayer down a little bit. You could probably get by with 25, 30 PSI, which is a lot lower than maybe if we're doing a hydraulic spray of plants. We're at 100 plus oftentimes. We're trying to create a lot of vortex and a lot of action with the spray. In this case, we don't want a lot of mist and a lot of stuff blowing around us. I liken this, Bill, it's always a hard example to do, but it's like painting the surface of a door. You're trying to get a uniform application of paint on that door. Too much and you're wasting paint, right? Yep. Not enough and you can see through, and you have some thin areas where you're not getting good coverage. You're thinking about a uniformity of application. And so, yes, you're referencing a video that we did, which is strictly geared towards calibration for smaller sprayers. So like a backpack sprayer, for example, in the case of a liquid application, or the good old belly grinder, the broadcast spreader that I've spent many an hour on the wrong side of before. And but those are the most commonly used techniques that growers use to apply. I highly suggest on one video, probably what's about 5, 6, 7 minutes long, we walk through calibration techniques for both of those, and I think they'd be very helpful. You can find those on our website.
I agree. And calibration is something that's much easier understood when you see it being done than sometimes when you read that label or see that chart on the packaging.
That's the number one question I get about Marengo is calibration.
I'm going to tag on to one thing that Steve said. Herbicide applications are different than other pesticide applications in that you really want those droplets to be big, whereas you don't want those, if they do end up hitting your plant, you want them to roll off your plants in our case, because this is a pre-emergent. It's not going to do anything if it's already emerged, but we don't want it to damage those plants that might have gotten accidentally hit. So using a big droplet really helps with that. It'll also do the spreading and coverage. When you're doing other pesticide applications, you're generally going to, a fine to a medium droplet, whereas for herbicide applications, you want to do a medium to quite a large droplet. So, and that also reduces your drift and everything as well.
That's a good point. And something, Steve, I've heard you say is that we're trying to kill a plant in a plant, and that's, I don't know, that stuck in my head since the first time I heard you say it, because it is kind of it's like a weird thing to think about, but that's exactly what we're doing here. And it makes sense that you don't want to blast an herbicide onto a crop.
And it gets into the whole issue of plant crop safety with the products. We're trying to selectively kill and save with a single application. And it's a grower's fault. They keep telling me last week that was a weed. And verbena used to be a weed on the roadside. Now it's a cultivated plant. I just make up your mind, if you would, please. We'll try to accommodate you.
Well, because my paycheck comes from a breeding company, I'm going to stay out of that conversation.
Mine comes from a chemical company, so yeah, we're in a little bit of conflict, but that's all right.
It's true.
We can work together. We can be friendly.
We can. And before we wrap it up, I do want to leave some time for any final thoughts, anything that we've missed, just anything, even if you want to reiterate something that you said. Either one of you can, or both of you can jump in with some kind of final thoughts.
Go get them, Doc.
I would say, regardless of what you choose something. The greatest cost is the cost of neglect, and we have the data to show what the cost of neglect is. I mean, it literally, by not applying any pre-emergent, the cost estimated in the Mather study was almost $7,000 per acre. And by including a pre-emergent, you can cut that cost, by, anywhere from 30 to 70%, depending on how aggressive you are with your use of herbicides. But I think it really is important, and trying to stay on top of things. It's just very easy for everything to go sideways, whether it's, weather related, labor related, or something else. And having this peace of mind when you put these pre-emergents down, to know that you don't have to do anything for several weeks to several months, and you can focus your labor on other things. There's a value there that we can't quantify. I wish we could quantify it, but we can't. So that's something to try and press upon people who are considering maybe making the switch to Marengo.
Gosh, I realize we're into almost 40 minutes or so here. It just seems like time flew by here. But the one, I'm so glad that Janna brought that point up, because we did funded a study of what's the cost of using a pre-emergent versus not using a pre-emergent, and the results were stunning. You save, in terms of costs per week of weed control, 70% of not using versus using. If you use a pre-emergent herbicide, you can save up to 70%. And almost all of that cost comes from labor. The cost of the chemical, the cost of the application of the chemical is a small fraction of the overall cost of treatment for an acre. I'm just going to use an acre as an example, especially for nurseries. They can relate to that. And it's stunning when you take that over the course of a season. It is literally thousands and thousands of man hours.
Yeah.
And I know from my work over the years and my current visits with growers today, number one issue, easily out of their mouth, labor. Scarcity of labor, cost of labor. And so it's something that it's hard to convince growers that paying $1,000 for a bottle of a pre-emergent herbicide on the front end can save me 3, 4, 5 times that in terms of labor costs is something that we struggle to tell that story, but it's a fact. And so if growers will get into the habit of using a pre-emergence rotation program with rotation of chemistries, we can save them a lot of labor that can be deployed elsewhere in the operation. And a lot of that, those savings go to one place. They go in your back pocket. And that's
for sure
important to remember.
Well, and it's also kind of a challenge to the listeners to pay attention and track those hours that your team has spent going out there and doing some weed eradication, because, it might not go into a quote cost center in your business, but it's being done. And if you're paying close attention to when those teams are out in the field cleaning up, you'll realize that the number of man hours being put in. This has really been a great discussion. You pointed out that we're about 40 minutes in, so we probably should wrap this up, even though I could talk about this stuff all day and listen to you guys talk about it all day. But it's been
all day too, so this is scary.
I know, because we're all nerds. But this has been a great conversation, and I know that the listeners would agree that your approach is both scientific and also sort of real world driven, because you've worked with a lot of growers and dealt with those kind of situations. Before we close, can you let the listeners know where they can find out more about Marengo and definitely Envu's other solutions for greenhouse and nursery? I will put a link to your website in the show notes, but there's a lot of really good information there. So where can folks find more information, and how can they connect with the team of technical gurus at Envu?
It's pretty simple. We just actually updated our website, and its functionality is really improved, in my opinion. But if you just go Envu, ENVU, Envu.com/ornamentals, or just do Envu ornamentals in a Google search, and it'll take you there.
Or Envu Marengo. I just tested that before. All of those should work. And if you need to get a hold of me, I can be reached as easily as Janna, JANNA.Beckerman@envu.com.
And I'm Steve.Larson with an O, Larson. I'm a Swede. Steve.Larson@envu.com.
Excellent. And I'm not going to put their emails in the show notes because all sorts of bots online will find that. But
they already
if you're listening, then you got it. Thank you guys so much. I know, and I expect that we'll talk again. Certainly, if you're coming out with new products for 2026, we got to talk about those. And the listeners will continue to read articles from you guys and the team at Envu and Growertalks. I do appreciate your knowledge, all your willingness to dive deep into this topic and product and share all these steps for growers. Our industry is comprised of all sorts of different types of operations: greenhouse, nursery, big, medium, small, like across the board, indoor, outdoor production. And Marengo does seem to have a use for just about everyone. So I appreciate it, you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bill. We'll be at Cultivate, so stop it.
Excellent.
Say hey.
Yes.
See what we look like. I've got a face for radio, you'll find right away. But
oh, that's good. That's good. That is a really good point, because this will be out before Cultivate. So when you're walking the show floor, make a beeline to the Envu booth and find out more about those products.
Thanks, Bill.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of Steve and Janna and the entire team at Envu, I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand, wishing you a fantastic season, hopefully free of weeds, and take care out there.